It was the 5th of September in the year 1921 when the golden glow of a holiday weekend dimmed into scandal. In a suite at the Grand St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, laughter had echoed, music had drifted, and glasses had been raised. Yet by the evening, the gaiety was replaced by panic. A young woman, known in the picture houses for her beauty, had fallen suddenly ill. She writhed in pain upon the bed, and a hush fell over the room. Her name was Virginia Rappe. Within days, she would be gone, and her death would become one of the earliest scandals to stain the history of Hollywood. Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin this long night's tale, I ask you to tell me in the comments when and where you are listening, so that we may weave a tapestry of memory across many lands. And do remember to subscribe, that these stories may continue their quiet journey through the corridors of time. The story begins with that fateful weekend where laughter and sorrow collided beneath the chandeliers of the St. Francis Hotel. The doors of Suite 1219 closed upon a gathering of actors, friends, and admirers. It was a holiday, Labor Day, and the guests had sought merriment in a time when prohibition forbade the open pouring of liquor, yet bottles appeared as if conjured. At the center of the gathering was Roscoe Arbuckle, known to millions as Fatty Arbuckle, the beloved clown of the silent screen. His figure filled the room, both in stature and in fame. But in that same room was Virginia, fragile yet radiant, whose life's thread was already worn thin. It is said that she laughed, that she danced, that she drank, and then that her laughter turned into groans of anguish. What transpired in that closed chamber is uncertain, and in truth may never be known. But what is certain is that by the end of the night, she lay weakened, pale, and trembling. Friends tried to help her, though some accused others of cruelty, and some spoke of a rough encounter. All that can be told is that a young woman's body betrayed her, and in those final days, she suffered greatly. One can almost hear the sounds of the hotel that day. The footsteps of bellhops along the carpeted corridors, the distant ringing of the telephone desk, the heavy clinking of ice brought to the suite in discreet trays. Within, laughter mixed with the sound of phonographs playing songs now long forgotten. In the midst of merriment, Virginia's body gave way. She clutched her abdomen, her voice calling out in agony, and those around her scrambled in confusion. Was it illness? Was it drink? Or was it something more sinister, whispered later in the press as violation? The truth lay hidden behind the velvet curtains of the room, and what survived were fragments, testimonies colored by fear, loyalty, and invention. Arbuckle, towering in fame, was stunned by the sudden calamity. Witnesses spoke of his attempts to soothe her, to fetch aid, and yet others accused him of cruelty. Such is the way of scandal, that one event is seen through 1,000 eyes, each telling its own truth. Virginia was eventually carried to another room, then to a hospital, but by then her fate was sealed. The pain did not subside. Doctors spoke of peritonitis, of ruptured organs, of an illness that had been building long before. But when she died on the 9th of September, the shadows gathered quickly, and her name was no longer that of a rising actress, but of a woman caught forever in one of Hollywood's earliest storms. Yet let us pause here, before judgment, before the hammer of the court or the cries of the newspaper. Let us linger in the silence of that hotel room and consider the fragility of life. A young woman, 29 years old, her ambition still forming, her future still unwritten, cut short in the whirl of revelry. How many lives are changed in moments such as these, when laughter turns to silence? And what does it mean when the truth of a life is forever tied to its ending? Perhaps you, listener, have wondered such things when standing by the grave of someone whose story is incomplete. It is important in this tale to remember Virginia as more than the victim of a scandal, to imagine her not merely as the headline of a trial, but as a woman of flesh and breath, whose laughter once rang clear, and whose eyes once lit with hope. That is the task of remembrance, to restore the person from the shadow of legend. And so we shall travel backwards through the veils of her life, from the closed door of the St. Francis Hotel to the streets of Chicago where she was born, and beyond. But before we leave this hotel room, let us fix the scene once more in memory. The drapes drawn against the afternoon sun, the half-empty glasses standing upon polished tables, the air thick with perfume and smoke, a phonograph needle scratching to its end, and in the midst of it all, a woman's cries echoing down the corridors, muffled by closed doors and reluctant ears. It is there, in that silence, that our journey begins. The door of the hotel room closes, and in the stillness beyond it we are carried backwards, as if drawn by the thread of memory itself, to another doorway, one that opened upon a far different world. It is Chicago in the year 1891, a city still in the process of remaking itself after the Great Fire of 20 years before, a place of soot and brick, of ceaseless construction and restless energy. Into this world came a child, Virginia Caroline Rappe, whose life began not with the glitter of Hollywood, but with the plain hardships of poverty and loss. Her father had already departed from life before her memories could take form, and her mother followed when Virginia was still very young. Thus the child entered her first years already surrounded by absence, a house of echoes more than voices, and it is worth pausing to consider what such silence might shape within the heart of a girl. The streets of Chicago in those days were lined with the sound of horses' hooves upon cobblestones, the rattle of carts, the call of newsboys crying out the day's headlines. Smoke from chimneys hung low across the neighborhoods, and the chill of the winds off Lake Michigan seeped into tenement rooms. It was not a city that gave freely to its children. It demanded effort, resilience, and often sacrifice. Virginia, motherless and fatherless, was left in the care of a grandmother for a time, but the feeling of belonging, of being firmly rooted, may have always escaped her. When one grows up without the steady gaze of parents, does the world itself not seem less secure, as if every smile and kindness could vanish with the next dawn? Perhaps this sense of impermanence stayed with her, guiding her later choices, her hunger for beauty, her need to be seen. In the late 19th century, Chicago was both a place of opportunity and danger. The World's Columbian Exposition would soon bring marvels and curiosities, but daily life for ordinary families remained harsh. Orphans and half-orphans filled the streets and the institutions, many of them turning to work before childhood had truly ended. Virginia's early years are not well recorded. Her story was not deemed worthy of notice until tragedy brought her name into print decades later. Yet we may imagine her wandering the narrow alleys, gazing at the posters pasted upon brick walls advertising theaters, concerts, and moving pictures in their earliest forms. Did she look upon those images and wonder if a life more luminous than her own might await her? Did she dream of escape from the soot and hardship into a world of music, fashion, and stage lights? By the time she entered her teenage years, she'd begun to shape herself toward that vision. She was said to be striking in appearance, with large eyes and a beauty that photographers found compelling. In Chicago, there were opportunities for models, not the kind we know today with grand stages and bright magazines, but smaller, local endeavors, where young women posed for painters, illustrators, or early fashion houses. Virginia stepped into this world, perhaps first out of necessity, and then with growing ambition. To pose was to be seen, and to be seen was to be remembered, at least for a time. For a girl who had lost so much in childhood, to be remembered may have felt like a fragile salvation. Yet one must wonder, what does it mean for beauty to be noticed so early, when it is still forming, when the self is still tender? For each approving gaze can lift the spirit, but it can also claim possession. Perhaps Virginia understood even then that beauty was both gift and burden, something that could open doors and yet leave her vulnerable to the desires of others. She had no strong family to protect her, no guiding hand to shield her from the harsher aspects of city life. Instead, she walked a path illuminated by the attention of strangers, a light that warmed her face but cast long shadows behind her. The turn of the century brought change. The film industry was just beginning its ascent, and many young women like Virginia looked toward it with hope. If one could no longer remain invisible in a city crowded with labor and poverty, perhaps one could step into the shimmering unreality of moving pictures, where stories were told without words, and where even silence itself seemed to speak. Chicago was, for a brief time, a center of film production before Hollywood drew the industry westward. It is not unlikely that Virginia, restless and seeking more, found herself drawn toward that migrating current, following it first in small steps and later in the full journey that carried her to California. But before we rush too quickly, let us pause again in her youth. A girl walking through the busy streets, the sound of a distant piano drifting from a tavern, the creak of wooden carts filled with coal, the scent of rain upon brick. Perhaps she paused to look at her own reflection in a shop window, the glass clouded, the image faint, and wondered who she would become. In her heart there may have been both longing and uncertainty, the orphan's awareness that nothing is secure, yet also the dreamer's conviction that life can change in an instant. How many others in those same streets held similar dreams, and how many were consumed by the city, their stories lost. Virginia's story, preserved only because of its tragic ending, reminds us that countless others lived and vanished without notice. She was both ordinary and extraordinary, a child of hardship, yet destined to have her name remembered long after those around her had faded. Is it chance or fate that grants such remembrance? Or is it the cruel irony that only scandal preserves certain lives from oblivion? We cannot answer these questions with certainty. We can only let them linger, like the echo of footsteps in an empty hallway. And so we leave Virginia in her Chicago years, a young girl shaped by loss, discovering her beauty and beginning to step into the fragile light of recognition. From these beginnings, her path would lead her ever onward toward the fragile stage of modeling, the uncertain promise of film, and eventually the world of silent pictures that beckoned from far away. Yet before that journey is told, let us close this part of her story with the sound of wind off Lake Michigan, carrying with it the voices of a city rebuilding itself, and a girl gazing outward into the distance, unaware of the storm that would one day make her name eternal. The image remains unresolved, a child standing at the threshold of possibility, her eyes on horizons we cannot yet see. The wind off Lake Michigan fades, carrying with it the uncertain image of a girl gazing at her reflection in a shop window. And when the breeze settles, we find her once more, no longer a child, but a young woman stepping into the gaze of others. The years of her adolescence have passed, and now Virginia moves into the realm of fashion and photography, where her face, her posture, her very presence become commodities to be captured and displayed. Modeling in those early years was a modest affair compared to the great magazines and runways of later decades, yet it was nonetheless a world of scrutiny, of approval and dismissal, where a young woman's worth could be measured by the turn of a head or the angle of a smile. Virginia entered this world not with fortune or influence, but with the fragile gifts of beauty and determination. To stand before a camera or the brush of an illustrator was, for her, to step out of obscurity and into a fragile sort of permanence. The studios where she posed were not grand palaces of light, but small rooms above shops, with makeshift backdrops and the smell of oil lamps. Photographers adjusted their cumbersome equipment, cloth draped over their heads as they peered into their machines, while assistants called for patience. In such settings, Virginia learned how to hold herself, how to arrange her body into lines of grace, how to let her gaze convey more than words could. She was not alone. Many young women sought the same work, but she carried into it a determination born of her orphanhood, a quiet refusal to be invisible any longer. She understood perhaps that her face could be her passage into another world, one far removed from the soot and chill of Chicago's streets. When one thinks of modeling, one imagines admiration and glamour, yet for Virginia, it may also have been an act of survival. The money earned, however modest, kept her moving forward, and the attention she received brought her into circles that promised further opportunities. There is a haunting question here. Did she pose with joy, feeling herself uplifted by the gaze of others? Or did she pose with unease, aware that beauty, once captured, belonged less to her and more to those who consumed it? The truth may be that she felt both, for the attention of the world is always double-edged. It nourishes and it wounds, it exalts and it diminishes. The fashions of the time shifted rapidly, and Virginia's appearance suited the moment. The turn of the century had begun to favor slender figures, graceful necks, and expressive eyes. She fit these ideals, and in doing so, she found herself courted by photographers and artists. Some accounts suggest she appeared in advertisements, her image associated with the products of a growing consumer culture. Imagine her likeness upon a page in a magazine, a stranger's household object elevated by her face, her posture, her smile. To be recognized in such a way was to achieve a measure of fame, though fleeting, a hint of the wider recognition she would later seek in film. Yet behind each photograph lay a question. Who was she when the camera was put away? Did she feel the weight of her orphaned childhood still pressing upon her, or did she believe she was truly leaving it behind? Modeling provided the appearance of belonging, of being wanted, but it did not guarantee security. The world of fashion and photography was fickle, subject to trends and the whims of those with money. A woman could be celebrated one year and forgotten the next. Perhaps Virginia, even as she smiled into the lens, felt the fragility of her position and sought more enduring forms of recognition. It was in these years that she also began to draw closer to the world of moving pictures. Chicago, though not yet Hollywood, had become a place of experimentation in film. The flicker of reels, the novelty of stories told in silent gestures, enchanted many. For a young woman who already understood how to convey emotion through posture and expression, the leap from still photography to motion was natural. And so Virginia's face, once fixed in photographs, began to flicker across screens, though often in small roles, her name sometimes omitted or misspelled. To act in those early years was not to achieve immediate fame, but to become part of an art form still inventing itself. How strange it must have been to see oneself moving upon a screen, gestures preserved in silence, a shadow self dancing before audiences who would never know the woman behind the image. And so the question arises, what is beauty if it can be captured but not kept? A photograph freezes a moment, a film preserves a movement, yet the woman herself continues to age, to change, to suffer. The image remains, but the flesh is fleeting. Virginia must have sensed this contradiction, for every actress of her time did. To live as an image was both triumph and tragedy. The world would remember the likeness, but forget the person. Does not each of us, in some quiet way, wrestle with the same fear, that we will be remembered not as we truly were, but as others chose to see us? Her modeling and early film work brought her into contact with those who moved more easily through the circles of art and performance. Directors, actors, and producers took notice of her, though not always for reasons that served her well. In such spaces, admiration and exploitation walked side by side. Virginia, young and eager, may have believed she was being offered opportunity, when in truth she was being pulled into the precarious balance of power that defined early Hollywood. She was learning how to be seen, but she had not yet learned how to protect herself from what that visibility demanded. And so we return to that unresolved image, the one we began with. Virginia's face caught in the lens of a photographer, the shutter closing, the moment preserved forever. Outside the studio, the streets of Chicago still roared with noise, carriages and streetcars carrying strangers with their own burdens and dreams. Within the studio, silence reigned, save for the click of equipment and the whispered instructions of the photographer. She stood there, poised and graceful, gazing into the unknown, unaware that her beauty would one day be remembered not for the joy it brought, but for the scandal that destroyed her. The photograph captures the surface, but not the storm that lay ahead. Let us leave her here, in that small studio, light falling across her shoulders, her eyes steady, her figure framed by painted backdrops. We do not yet know what roads she will walk, nor what trials she will endure. We see only the hope of a young woman determined to be remembered, her likeness fixed, while her true self remains, for the moment beyond our reach. The painted backdrop of the photography studio fades, and with it the stillness of a frozen pose dissolves into motion. The shutter's click lingers in the air like a faint echo, and then it gives way to a new rhythm, the whirring of reels, the flicker of light against a wall, the stuttering birth of moving pictures. Virginia steps from the silence of photographs into the uncertain shimmer of cinema, and in this transition we sense both continuity and change. Where once she was asked to hold herself still, now she is asked to move, to breathe, to perform within the frame. The difference may seem slight, but it carried her into a world both grander and more perilous, the new realm of silent film where dreams were conjured without words and lives could be transformed or consumed by the power of the screen. In those early days, Hollywood was not yet the sunlit empire we imagine. The film industry was still wandering, shifting its roots from the East Coast and Chicago toward the golden hills of California. The land itself was inexpensive, the skies bright and steady, the climate mild enough for filming without interruption. By the time Virginia arrived in California, the place was already humming with experiments. Small studios sprouted like saplings, each attempting to capture audiences with new spectacles. Actors were plentiful, and actresses too, though many remain nameless. Their faces familiar, yet their identities blurred. It was into this crowded world that Virginia carried her beauty and her resolve, hoping to shape herself into someone remembered not only in still portraits, but in moving shadows that reached the eyes of strangers in distant towns. Her first steps in film were modest. She appeared in bit parts, often unnamed, her presence adding a touch of grace to the unfolding stories. In some reels, she walked past the camera. In others, she danced or lingered at the edge of a scene. Her name was sometimes misspelled, sometimes omitted altogether, a common fate for actresses at the bottom of the long ladder of the studios. Yet there is evidence she gained recognition in small circles, admired for her expressive features, her ability to convey emotion with a glance or a gesture. In the silent era, words were denied to actors. All that mattered was how the body spoke. Virginia, who had already learned in the studios of Chicago how to project herself into stillness, carried that knowledge into movement. She knew how to hold a posture, how to let her eyes widen in longing or narrow in pain, how to suggest what could not be spoken. Still, the film world was not gentle. For every star who rose, many more flickered and vanished. Virginia was caught in the uncertain space between promise and obscurity, her name sometimes mentioned in publicity but rarely central. She sought larger roles, greater recognition, but the industry was capricious. For women especially, success was as fragile as glass, dependent upon the gaze of men who controlled casting and the ever-shifting taste of audiences. Virginia's beauty could open doors, but beauty alone could not guarantee permanence. And perhaps, within her, there lingered the awareness that each opportunity might dissolve as quickly as it appeared, just as her parents had vanished from her childhood, leaving absence where there should have been stability. To step into early Hollywood was also to enter a place of illusions. Sets were built to resemble grand palaces, though constructed from flimsy wood and canvas. Costumes sparkled under the lights but frayed when examined closely. The entire industry was a fragile trick, convincing audiences that dreams could be real. Virginia, living within this world, must have felt the dissonance between appearance and reality. Did she walk through those constructed sets and wonder how long such illusions could last? Did she sense that her own role in Hollywood would be shaped by the same fragile balance between what was shown and what was true? There is little record of her thoughts, but those who later recalled her spoke of ambition tempered by vulnerability. She was not a woman hardened by wealth or family connections. She was a woman who sought belonging through her beauty and talent, but who carried within her the scars of loss. In the studios, surrounded by actors and directors, she may have felt both possibility and peril. Each gaze upon her could be a chance for advancement, but also a risk of exploitation. How many silent actresses walked the same line, their futures dependent not upon skill alone, but upon the whims of those who controlled the industry? Virginia's name appeared occasionally in the press, often in association with her modeling work or minor film appearances. Her image was circulated more widely than her performances, a sign of the imbalance between her potential and the roles she was given. Yet there was within her a persistence, a refusal to vanish. She remained in the orbit of film, attending gatherings, cultivating connections, seeking out the fragile ladder that might lift her to greater heights. Among those connections were friendships and romances, some of them bringing stability, others carrying her deeper into Hollywood's volatile currents. It is here, in the threshold between obscurity and recognition, that we must pause and reflect upon anonymity and ambition. For what is ambition if not the refusal to remain unseen? And what is anonymity but the shadow in which countless lives are lived and forgotten? Virginia, orphaned in childhood, may have felt more keenly than others the terror of being forgotten. To step onto the screen, however small the role, was to fight against that erasure. Even if her name was misspelled or omitted, her face had been captured in movement, preserved in the flicker of reels. She had entered history, if only in fragments. Imagine her walking home after a day at the studio, the California air warmer than the winds of Chicago, the sun setting behind the hills. Perhaps she wondered whether audiences in distant towns were watching her face that very evening, recognizing her, though they did not know her name. Perhaps she longed for the day when her name would be spoken clearly in theaters, printed boldly in newspapers, not as a curiosity, but as a star. Yet alongside that longing may have been doubt, for the ladder was steep and each rung uncertain. The silent world of film was a place of opportunity and peril alike. It gave to some eternal fame, and to others, silence. Virginia was caught between those fates, moving forward but not yet secure, visible but not yet celebrated. Her story, as we know, would not reach the triumph she might have imagined. But for now, let us leave her in this moment of possibility, standing at the edge of a film set, the whir of the projector beginning, her figure poised to step into the light. The reel flickers, the image trembles, and her shadow self begins to move across the screen. The projector's hum continues into the night, unresolved, as if asking whether this fragile image will endure or fade. The reel flickers, the image trembles, and as the whir of the projector fades, we see Virginia step away from the bright set lights into the dimmer rooms where friendships and affections grew, where the business of Hollywood blended with the intimacies of human need. The industry of moving pictures was young, uncertain, and yet within its fragile walls people formed bonds that sustained them, however briefly. Virginia, adrift in a city far from her beginnings, sought not only work but companionship. For an orphan who had known absence more than presence, the faces around her became a substitute for family, a chosen circle within which she might find comfort and belonging. Among these figures stood Henry Lehrman, a director and sometime actor, a man who had carved his own path from immigrant obscurity into Hollywood's bustling workshops of comedy. To him, Virginia attached her hopes and perhaps her heart. Their relationship was known enough to be remarked upon in passing, though its true contours remain hidden in time. Some said he was her fiancé, others that he was merely a companion. What matters more than the certainty of their bond is the way it represented, for Virginia, an anchor in a restless world. In Lerman, she may have seen stability, protection, a partner who could guide her further into the heart of the film industry. Yet love in Hollywood was rarely simple. The studios blurred the lines between work and personal life, and many relationships were both genuine and transactional. Did Lerman see in Virginia merely a beautiful face to adorn his productions, or did he truly feel the tenderness of devotion? Did Virginia see in him a doorway into larger opportunities, or did she simply wish for companionship? The truth may lie in the spaces between these questions, as it so often does in human affairs. What is certain is that their bond placed her more firmly within Hollywood's networks, while at the same time tethering her fate to his choices. Beyond Lerman, there were other friendships, fragile yet meaningful. Actresses who, like Virginia, sought recognition in a crowded field, shared with her the weight of auditions, the sting of rejection, and the fleeting joys of small successes. They must have gathered in rented rooms, their laughter rising above the uncertain knowledge that few among them would become stars. In such circles, gossip and dreams mingled freely, each woman hoping to catch the eye of a director or to find her name in print. Virginia, with her beauty and her vulnerability, likely inspired both admiration and envy among her companions. And so the gossip columns, always hungry for stories, began to mention her name more often. She was noted for her appearances at parties, her connections to men of influence, her presence at the edges of Hollywood's social life. These mentions did not make her famous, but they ensured she was not invisible. To be named, even in a single sentence, was to exist within the public's imagination. For Virginia, who had once been a child nearly forgotten, such small acknowledgments may have felt like proof that she was truly moving forward, that her life had gained substance beyond her private struggles. But each whisper, each printed line also exposed her to judgment. The world in which she lived was quick to categorize women as pure or fallen, innocent or cunning, angel or temptress. A young actress who sought opportunity risked being seen not as ambitious but as calculating, not as gifted but as alluring. Virginia's beauty, the very quality that opened doors for her, also cast shadows upon her reputation. How wearying it must have been to live under such scrutiny, where each choice could be interpreted in ways that diminished her. Did she feel herself trapped between the need to be noticed and the fear of being misjudged? One imagines her walking into a gathering, perhaps a studio party, her gown carefully chosen, her eyes scanning the room. Laughter swells around her. The music of a piano fills the air. Smoke curls upward from cigarettes, and she moves through the throng, both welcomed and watched. Some admire her grace, others whisper doubts, but all notice her. She smiles, she speaks, she plays her part in the social drama that was as essential to Hollywood as the films themselves. Yet inside, perhaps she longed for a truer connection, one that would see her not as a symbol or a possibility, but as a woman shaped by loss, by longing, by dreams that extended beyond the glitter of the moment. Lerman's presence in her life gave her such a semblance of belonging, yet he was himself a figure of contradictions. He had ambition, humor, and influence, but he was also restless, sometimes careless with those around him. Their relationship was marked by both closeness and instability. In the years that followed, when Virginia's name would be forever tied to scandal, Lerman would claim her memory, defending her in public, though some doubted his motives. It is difficult to know whether his love was steadfast or opportunistic, but in the years before the tragedy, he was one of the central figures in her world, and his companionship shaped her path. Reflect, dear listener, on the nature of love in such a place and time. Is it possible to separate affection from ambition, tenderness from convenience, in a world where survival depends upon connection? Can one truly know if one is cherished for oneself or valued for the advantages one brings? Virginia's story suggests that the lines blur, that human bonds in Hollywood were often tangled with the necessities of career and reputation. And yet love, however flawed, must have offered her moments of reprieve. In the long evenings when the lights of Los Angeles twinkled across the hills, perhaps she sat with Lerman or with friends, speaking not of roles or opportunities, but of childhood memories, of hopes for the future, of the simple desire to belong. In those private moments, away from cameras and gossip, she may have found the comfort that eluded her in her public life. For even in the most scrutinized of lives, there exist hidden hours of tenderness, invisible to the world, but precious to the one who lives them. Still, the gossip columns persisted, recording her presence at events, linking her name with others, shaping her public image without her consent. A whisper here, a photograph there, and suddenly Virginia was more story than person, her true self submerged beneath the perceptions of strangers. She became, in the eyes of many, not an actress striving to succeed, but a figure of rumor, a beauty whose life was to be watched, interpreted, and judged. And so this part of her story closes with the faint echo of her name, spoken in hushed tones at a gathering, her laughter blending with the music of the piano, her figure drifting through a room where admiration and suspicion mingled like smoke. We do not yet know where these relationships will carry her, nor how the whispers will shape her fate. We only know that she is seen, remembered, spoken of, her presence undeniable, yet her essence still obscured. The image remains unresolved, a young woman standing at the center of a room filled with chatter, her smile bright but her thoughts unreadable, her future both near at hand and impossibly distant. The music of a piano fades, the laughter of a gathering dissolves into smoke, and from that crowded room steps another figure, large in presence, heavy in fame, and impossible to ignore. Roscoe Arbuckle, known to the world by the affectionate name Fatty, carried within his form the contradictions of his age. To millions he was a beloved comedian, his films bringing laughter to children and adults alike. His body, immense and round, was itself the source of countless gags, yet he could move with a grace that belied his size, tumbling and pratfalling with astonishing agility. To Hollywood, he was a symbol of success, a man whose work drew audiences and filled coffers. To Virginia, his path would one day converge with hers, and together their names would be locked in scandal from which neither could escape. Arbuckle's rise had been meteoric. He began in vaudeville, where the roar of audiences gave him confidence, and by the 19-teens, he was among the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. His laughter was infectious, his childlike expressions endearing, and his ability to mock himself without bitterness endeared him to the masses. He was not a romantic hero, nor a tragic figure. He was a clown, and in the silent world, a clown's gestures spoke more powerfully than words ever could. Yet fame is a weight as much as a crown. Arbuckle lived in a body that drew constant commentary, constant laughter, and while he made his fortune through that very laughter, he also carried the weariness of being reduced to an image. How often must he have wondered whether people saw him as a man or merely as the fatty they adored? When his path crossed with Virginia's, the imbalance of their positions could not be ignored. He was one of the most famous comedians of his day. She, a struggling actress, noted more for her beauty than for her roles. Their orbits overlapped at gatherings, at parties, in the tangled web of Hollywood social life, where actors, directors, and hopefuls mingled freely. To Virginia, Arbuckle must have seemed larger than life, his presence filling any room. To Arbuckle, Virginia may have appeared as yet another young actress at the edges of fame, graceful and admired, but without the power to shape her own narrative? Did he see her as a person, or as one among many faces drifting through his circles? Did she view him with admiration, envy, or unease? The truth, as with so much in this story, lies hidden behind the silence of passing years. It is worth pausing here to reflect upon the nature of fame, especially in that dawning age of cinema. For Arbuckle, fame was both shield and snare. His wealth allowed him comforts, his reputation secured him opportunities, yet it also made him vulnerable to scrutiny, to envy, to the constant gaze of a public eager for both triumphs and scandals. For Virginia, ambition and vulnerability entwined. To be in the presence of a star was to brush against the possibility of greater recognition, but also to risk being consumed by his gravity. Theirs was not a balanced encounter, but one shaped by the unequal power of a famous man and a woman still struggling for a foothold. And yet, in those days before tragedy, there was laughter. Arbuckle's friends recalled his joviality, his generosity, his penchant for parties. He was known to entertain lavishly, even recklessly, pouring drink despite prohibition, inviting friends and admirers to share in his wealth. Virginia, moving within these same circles, became one of many who attended such gatherings. Picture the scene: a hotel suite filled with chatter, music from a Victrola spinning familiar tunes, glasses clinking, women in fashionable dresses, and men in tailored suits, the air hazy with smoke. At the center, Arbuckle's booming laugh carried above the noise, drawing attention, commanding the room. Among the faces nearby, Virginia's could sometimes be found, her beauty catching the light, her eyes perhaps watching him with curiosity. How easily in such moments human beings are reduced to symbols. Arbuckle, the symbol of joy and excess; Virginia, the symbol of beauty and fragility. And yet beneath these symbols lived real people, with histories of pain, of longing, of loneliness. Arbuckle, for all his laughter, carried private struggles. Virginia, for all her grace, carried the weight of orphanhood and insecurity. Their encounter would later be painted in black and white by the press, guilty and innocent, villain and victim. But in truth, both were human, flawed, vulnerable, swept into a storm greater than themselves. Consider how fame and obscurity meet. For one, every action is magnified. For the other, every misstep risks erasure. Arbuckle could not escape notice. Virginia could not secure permanence. When their stories intertwined, the imbalance between them created a tragedy neither had foreseen. And so, as the gossip columns continued to whisper her name, and as Arbuckle's fame reached its height, the shadows lengthened. The two paths, separate yet destined to collide, moved ever closer until they met within the walls of the St. Francis Hotel. Yet let us not leap ahead too quickly. Before the scandal, there was the sense of inevitability, the way certain lives seem drawn together by circumstance. Arbuckle, wealthy, restless, indulgent; Virginia, fragile, ambitious, seeking belonging. The world of Hollywood was not vast but intimate, its parties gathering the same faces again and again. A shared table, a mutual acquaintance, a chance meeting in a studio corridor. Such were the threads that wove their fates. We can only imagine the conversations they shared, the glances exchanged, the subtle negotiations of presence that pass between any two souls when they find themselves within the same orbit. Did Virginia laugh at his jokes, charmed by his charisma, or did she feel overshadowed, her own ambitions diminished by his fame? Did Arbuckle see her as yet another fleeting beauty, or did he sense the fragility beneath her smile? These questions unanswered linger like shadows at the edge of the reel. What we know is that their paths converged in that fateful September, and that from that moment forward their names could never be separated. The sound of Arbuckle's footsteps echoes down a hallway now, heavy, deliberate, and filled with foreboding. We imagine him moving through the corridors of the hotel, his presence impossible to ignore, while Virginia, elsewhere in the suite, moved with quieter steps, her beauty casting a different kind of gravity. The two lives, so different in their origins, so unequal in their power, were about to collide in ways that neither could control. And as we leave this part of the story, we are left not with judgment, not with certainty, but with the sound of those footsteps echoing against the walls, each one carrying us closer to the closed door that would define the rest of their lives. The echo of Arbuckle's footsteps down the hotel corridor fades into the stillness of a single room, a suite meant for celebration, but soon to be remembered for whispers of ruin. The year is 1921, and the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco stands proud and gleaming, its marble halls filled with the murmur of guests, its chandeliers casting golden light. In Suite 1219, the doors have closed upon a holiday gathering, and what began as laughter has shifted into unease. Virginia Rappe, whose presence had been graceful in so many rooms before, now lies doubled in pain, her body betraying her before the eyes of startled companions. The phonograph that once filled the air with songs continues to spin, its melody now jarring against her cries. Those who had come for revelry look to one another, uncertain, their amusement dissolving into confusion. Accounts of what transpired within that chamber differ, and perhaps will always differ. Some said that Virginia had been drinking too freely, though friends later insisted she was not fond of liquor. Some claimed she had fallen ill suddenly, with spasms of pain that no one could explain. Others whispered of roughness, of a struggle, of an encounter with Arbuckle himself that left her broken. The truth, sealed behind that closed door, was never spoken with one voice. What remains are fragments, testimonies written and rewritten, each shaped by fear, loyalty, and imagination. Even those present could not agree upon the details, and so we are left with uncertainty, as if trying to reconstruct a shattered mirror with pieces missing. It is said that Arbuckle, alarmed, tried to help her. One witness recalled him laughing at her distress, as if mocking her. Another swore he expressed concern, fetching assistance when it became clear that she was in agony. Which account should we believe? Perhaps none entirely. Human memory bends easily under the weight of scandal, and in the presence of fame, stories reshape themselves like shadows under moving light. What we do know is that Virginia's cries filled the suite, and her pain was undeniable. She clutched at her abdomen, twisting upon the bed, her face pale, her voice strained. Her companions tried to soothe her, laying cool cloths upon her skin, opening windows to let in air, yet nothing seemed to ease her suffering. In the midst of the confusion, accusations were whispered. One friend, Maud Delmont, who had accompanied her, would later tell police that Arbuckle had harmed Virginia. Others denied it, insisting her collapse was sudden and unexplained. And so, even in the very moment of her illness, the seeds of scandal were sown. Let us pause here and imagine the atmosphere of that room, the curtains partly drawn against the afternoon glare, the scent of perfume mixed with smoke, and the bitter tang of alcohol poured in defiance of prohibition, the guests shifting uneasily, their laughter hushed, their eyes drawn again and again to the figure writhing upon the bed, the music faltering as someone bumped the phonograph, the record scratching, the needle stuttering. Above all, the sound of Virginia's voice, low at first, then rising in sharp cries that pierce through the gaiety like a knife. What does one do when joy turns to anguish so suddenly, when the body of a companion becomes the center of fear? Some look to Arbuckle, expecting his authority as host to restore order. Some look to Delmont, expecting her to shield her friend. All were unprepared for what had arrived, as if tragedy itself had entered through the door disguised as merriment. For Virginia, the moment must have felt endless. Pain can stretch time, each second expanding until it feels like an eternity. She had suffered ailments before, Her health was never strong, and rumors of internal troubles had followed her. But this was different. The sharpness, the unrelenting force of it left her unable to stand. Perhaps she wondered, in those moments of confusion, what had brought her to this place, to this gathering, to this city so far from her beginnings. Perhaps she thought of Lehrman, or of her lost mother, or perhaps she thought of nothing at all, consumed only by the waves of pain. In that instant, she ceased to be the admired figure of parties or films. She was simply a woman in torment, her body demanding attention that no one knew how to give. The reactions of those around her reveal much about the human heart when faced with suffering. Some tried to help, though clumsily. Cold water was poured over her, as if to shock her back to composure. Clothes were loosened, windows opened, sheets changed. Others withdrew, uncomfortable, unwilling to witness such vulnerability. And Arbuckle, at the center of it all, became both accused and defender, his every gesture later interpreted in conflicting ways. Did he press ice to her lips gently, or did he forcefully attempt to quiet her? Did he laugh at her condition, or did he panic, uncertain of what else to do? Each witness chose a version of the truth, and the newspapers would soon amplify these versions into spectacle. Here we must reflect on how stories fracture when truth is hidden. The door of that hotel room became a barrier not only to outsiders, but to certainty itself. Within, events unfolded that no single account could capture wholly. Without, the world speculated, invented, and judged. Virginia's body in pain became a vessel for the fears and desires of others. Her cries twisted into symbols of innocence or decadence depending upon the teller. How fragile is truth when it is mediated through so many voices, each carrying its own burden of loyalty and fear. Eventually, Virginia was carried from the room, moved to another suite where she might rest. But the pain did not relent. She was later taken to a hospital where doctors puzzled over her condition. They suspected peritonitis, an inflammation of the abdominal lining, possibly from a ruptured bladder or other internal injury. Yet even they could not agree upon the cause. Some whispered of violence, others of illness long neglected. And so, even under the care of medicine, certainty eluded her. All that could be known was that her suffering continued, her strength fading, her voice growing weaker as the days passed. But here, at the close of this part, we remain within the suite, not yet in the hospital ward. The image lingers of Virginia upon the bed, her hands clutching at the sheets, her companions shifting around her, Arbuckle's figure looming nearby, uncertain, accused, perhaps guilty, perhaps not. The music has stopped. The glasses stand half empty. The air is heavy with tension. Outside the door, the corridor of the hotel remains quiet, unaware that history is being written within. Inside, a bed creaks in silence, marking the rhythm of a life at the threshold of tragedy. The creak of the bed fades, and from the stillness of that dim hotel suite, we follow the figure of Virginia as she is carried outward through hushed corridors, past the marble gleam of the St. Francis lobby, and into the world beyond. Her cries linger in memory, but now her body is weakened, her voice dimmed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Companions gather about her, some earnest, some uncertain, each wondering what is to come. The revelry of the holiday weekend has long since withered. What remains is the dread silence of suffering. Soon she is delivered to a hospital where the air smells not of perfume and spilled liquor, but of disinfectant, soap, and the sharp sting of ether. Here, within stark walls, doctors peer at her with furrowed brows, puzzled by the sudden collapse of a young woman. They examine her abdomen, press upon her tender skin, whisper to one another in low tones. Peritonitis is suspected, the inflammation of the lining that holds the body's core together, a condition merciless in its pain. Some speak of a ruptured bladder, others of an internal infection long in the making. The exact cause eludes them, and their uncertainty becomes fertile soil for rumor. For what doctors do not declare, the public will invent. And so, even before Virginia's life has ended, whispers of scandal begin to take shape in the streets outside. She lies in her hospital bed, sheets pulled close around her, eyes half-lidded, breath shallow. The friends who visit see her beauty stripped of its glamour, her hair damp against her forehead, her face pale. They remember the woman who danced at gatherings, who posed with grace for photographers, who sought her chance upon the flickering screen. Now they see only her fragility. Some weep, some turn away, unable to bear the sight. In their hearts they must have wondered, was this simply fate, the cruelty of the body, or had some violence hastened her decline? The doctors, caught between duty and doubt, continue their examinations, but they cannot agree. In the days that follow, their uncertainty will be replaced by confidence in one direction or another, each statement seized upon by newspapers, each contradiction fueling speculation. Yet in this moment, within the stillness of the ward, they are only men struggling with the mysteries of the body. Virginia, slipping further into illness, may have sensed their hesitation, their inability to save her. Perhaps she drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind wandering to earlier days, to the streets of Chicago, to the faces of those she had loved. Or perhaps her pain was too great for thought, her world reduced to nothing but the rhythm of her breath and the ache within her. Meanwhile, beyond those sterile walls, the story had already begun to spread. Word of the incident at the St. Francis traveled quickly. A woman had fallen ill at a party hosted by Roscoe Arbuckle, one of Hollywood's brightest stars. That alone was enough to stir curiosity, for the public had grown accustomed to whispers of Hollywood's excesses, of its hidden vices beneath the glamour. Prohibition had made liquor forbidden, and thus all the more alluring. Parties such as Arbuckle's became symbols of rebellion, of indulgence, of decadence. The news of a young woman's sudden collapse in such a setting confirmed the suspicions many already held. The details were unclear, but the narrative had begun. Innocence corrupted, revelry turned to ruin, a beloved comedian's world shadowed by disgrace. Within the hospital, Virginia's pain persisted. Nurses moved about her quietly, adjusting her pillows, offering sips of water, wiping sweat from her brow. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridors. The distant ringing of bells summoned doctors from ward to ward. She remained the center of a small circle of attention. Yet outside her room, the world pressed closer, eager to seize upon her fate. Reporters sniffed for details. Telephones rang. Gossip swelled. In the space between her weakening body and the hunger of the public, rumor became truth, and truth became rumor, indistinguishable one from the other. It is a cruel irony that even as Virginia lay suffering, her story was no longer her own. Others spoke for her. Friends, witnesses, journalists, doctors, each offering versions that suited their needs or beliefs. Some declared she was the victim of Arbuckle's violence, a martyr to Hollywood's hidden sins. Others dismissed her as a woman of loose morals. Her fate, the consequence of indulgence. In both versions, she was a symbol, not a person. The complexity of her life, her orphaned childhood, her ambitions, her longing for recognition, was lost. She became a mirror in which society reflected its fears and judgments. And here we must pause to consider how quickly public curiosity grows, like wildfire fed by the winds of uncertainty. The human heart hungers for stories, especially stories that blend beauty, tragedy, and scandal. Virginia offered all three. She was young and striking. She was dead, or soon would be, and she was connected to one of the most famous men in America. Her suffering became spectacle, her body the stage upon which society enacted its anxieties about morality, fame, and the dangers of indulgence. Before she could even speak her truth, the world had spoken for her. Within the hospital room, however, time moved slowly. The days stretched, marked by the rise and fall of her breathing, the footsteps of nurses, the mutter of doctors. For Virginia, each hour must have felt like an eternity, her pain unrelenting, her strength ebbing. Perhaps there were moments of clarity when she looked upon the faces of her companions and tried to speak, tried to leave behind some final words. Perhaps there were moments when she drifted into a haze, her mind slipping free of the body's torment. What thoughts visited her in those final hours we cannot know. Did she sense the storm building outside, the scandal that would define her memory? Or did she remain locked in the immediacy of her suffering, oblivious to the world's gaze? Her companions standing at her bedside surely felt the weight of helplessness. To watch a friend suffer and be unable to ease her pain is among the heaviest burdens. Some may have prayed, others despaired. And still, Arbuckle's name lingered in their minds, either as comforter or culprit, depending upon their view. They could not yet know how the trials to come would tear apart reputations and destroy careers. In that moment, all they knew was that Virginia's life was slipping away, and nothing they could do would bring her back. And so, as this part of her story closes, we leave her in the hospital ward, the sheets pulled close, the windows open to let in air, the smell of disinfectant heavy in the room. Beyond those walls, reporters sharpen their pens, editors prepare their headlines. The public leans closer to the story that has only just begun. Inside, a young woman lies between life and death, her body still trembling, her fate still uncertain. The corridor outside echoes with the sound of hurried steps, each one carrying the news outward, each one drawing the world closer to her bedside. The image remains unresolved. A door half open, a faint breeze moving the curtain, and Virginia's shadow falling softly upon the wall. The hospital curtain stirs in the faint breeze, a shadow cast upon the wall, and when it settles, the silence deepens. Time has passed, days perhaps, though in the rhythm of suffering it is impossible to mark hours clearly. The world outside has already seized upon the story, spinning rumors, shaping headlines. But here within the ward, the only truth is the steady decline of Virginia Rappe. Her voice has grown faint, her strength almost gone. Nurses come and go, physicians lean close, companions linger with drawn faces, but nothing halts the slow unraveling of her body. On the 9th of September, in the year 1921, her breath at last falters, and the thread of her life breaks. She is 29 years old. Death in such a place carries no grandeur. It comes quietly, in a room already heavy with despair. The sheets are drawn up, the lamps lowered, the sound of footsteps softens. A nurse marks the hour on a chart. Those who stood by her may have wept or may have sat in stunned silence, unable to grasp that her suffering was over, that she had slipped beyond their reach. For Virginia, who had begun her life in the absence of parents, who had wandered through hardship and uncertainty, the end came not with family at her side, but with friends and strangers, in a sterile room far from the warmth of home. And yet, even before her body cooled, her death ceased to belong to her. The world outside, ravenous for sensation, had already transformed her passing into a spectacle. Reporters hurried to telephones, editors summoned printers, headlines were set in type. "Arbuckle party girl dead," some read. "Actress dies after orgy," others declared. The words were brutal, stripped of compassion, fashioned to sell papers rather than honor the woman who had just perished. She was no longer Virginia, child of Chicago, orphan, model, actress with fragile hopes. She was a story, a symbol, a scandal. The ink upon the page carried her name further than her films ever had, yet carried it with distortion and cruelty. It is here that we must reflect upon how quickly a life can be taken from the person who lived it and handed to the world as legend. Death often brings remembrance, but in Virginia's case, remembrance came already tangled with accusation. Was she victim or temptress, innocent or corrupt, pure or fallen? The public demanded an answer, and in their haste to answer, They erased her complexity. How often do we do the same, shaping the lives of the departed into neat tales that soothe our need for certainty, even as we betray the truth of their humanity? For Virginia, there was no funeral procession yet, no quiet time of mourning. Her death was immediately consumed by controversy. Arbuckle, the host of the party, the man whose fame had once brought laughter to millions, became the central figure in the storm. Within hours, accusations pointed toward him. Delmont, her companion, declared that Virginia had been assaulted. Others contradicted her. Doctors hesitated. The courts had not yet convened, and yet in the court of public opinion the trial had already begun. But here, in this moment, let us not follow Arbuckle. Let us remain with Virginia, who lies still upon her hospital bed, her face calm at last after days of pain. What remains of her in this silence? Perhaps, if one could step back from the noise, one could see the arc of her life not as scandal, but as tragedy. The orphan girl seeking beauty, the young woman stepping into photographs, the actress striving for recognition, the friend, the lover, the dreamer. Each part of her life still exists, though drowned now in headlines. To honor her even for a moment is to remember that she was more than the cause of a trial. She was human, with all the contradictions and yearnings of humanity. Her death did not silence the world, but it did silence her own voice. She could no longer defend herself, no longer tell her own story. In the absence of her words, others spoke for her, and in their speaking they reshaped her memory. How many of us fear such a fate, that after death we will not be remembered as we truly were, but as others choose to imagine us? Perhaps this is why the story of Virginia Rappe continues to haunt. She stands not only as a figure of scandal, but as a reminder of how fragile memory is, how easily a person can be transformed into myth. In the days that followed, her body was prepared, her name printed in endless columns of ink, her image shown again and again, not as an actress, but as a victim. Some readers pitied her, some condemned her, but few asked who she truly had been. In Chicago, where her life began, perhaps there were still those who remembered the orphan girl, the young woman who dreamed of more. In Hollywood, where her ambitions had carried her, there were friends who knew her laughter, her determination, her kindness. But these voices were drowned by the roar of scandal. The presses rolled through the night, their clatter filling the air with urgency. The smell of ink spread through the city, mingling with the damp fog of San Francisco evenings. Boys carried stacks of papers through the streets, shouting headlines that promised intrigue. The world awoke to the story, eager for details, ready to take sides. The truth of Virginia's life, and even of her death, was already lost beneath the weight of sensation. She had become part of history, but not in the way she might have dreamed. Let us close this part of her story with a quiet image, not of headlines, but of her alone. The hospital room is still, the sheets smooth, the curtain drawn against the light. Outside, the world clamors, but within the chamber, all is silence. Her face, no longer contorted with pain, seems at peace. A nurse sets a small lamp beside her bed, its flame steady, casting a gentle glow. For one brief moment before memory hardens into scandal, Virginia Rappe rests in stillness, a life complete though unfinished, a soul departed into mystery. The presses thunder in the distance, but here there is only silence, the silence of a young woman whose story has ended, and yet, paradoxically, has only just begun. The silence of the hospital chamber lingers. The lamp's glow steady upon Virginia's still face, but from beyond those walls, a new sound begins to intrude. It is the clatter of machinery, the roar of presses, the hurried voices of editors, the shuffle of newsboys running with arms full of freshly printed papers. That quiet image of peace is broken by the thunder of words that spread faster than morning ever could. In bold type, her name appears across the nation, not in praise for her beauty, nor in recognition of her ambition, but as the headline of Scandal. Actress dies after Arbuckle party. Orgy in hotel ends in death. Star of screen accused of violence. Each phrase strips her of dignity, reducing her to a symbol, a curiosity, a cautionary tale for a public hungry to peer into the hidden lives of Hollywood. Within hours, the story has ceased to belong to Virginia or to those who knew her. It belongs to the press, to the public imagination, to the endless appetite for sensation. Reporters, some with scraps of truth, others with pure invention, reconstruct the scene of the St. Francis Hotel in lurid detail. They describe champagne flowing despite prohibition, women dancing with abandon, a famous comedian presiding over it all. Into this scene they place Virginia, sometimes as an innocent lured into danger, sometimes as a figure of temptation whose own choices led her to ruin. Arbuckle, too, is painted in stark tones, either as a monster whose appetite destroyed her or as a jovial man ensnared in a misunderstanding. The lines are drawn, and the war of narratives begins. For the public, starved of both entertainment and moral certainty, the story offers both. Hollywood had long been whispered about as a place of sin and excess, where women cast aside modesty for fame, where men of wealth indulged themselves beyond measure. Prohibition had made every glass of liquor a symbol of rebellion, and here, in the death of Virginia Rappe, was proof, or so it seemed, that the indulgence of the screen had consequences in flesh and blood. The newspapers fanned these flames eagerly, their headlines crafted to both shock and confirm suspicion. What was lost in the frenzy was the woman herself, her life, and her pain. Some papers depicted her as a tragic victim, a pure young actress destroyed by a powerful man. They described her fragility, her orphaned past, her struggle to succeed, turning her into a martyr for innocence in a corrupt industry. Others portrayed her as a fallen woman, prone to drink, reckless in her choices, a temptress whose death was merely the culmination of a life of excess. In both versions, Virginia was denied her complexity. She was either angel or sinner, and in either case, she was silenced. How often does the world demand such simplicity, reducing people to archetypes that can be easily consumed? Arbuckle, once beloved for his laughter, found himself trapped in this storm. His image, too, was splashed across the papers, no longer the smiling clown of the screen, but the accused, the monstrous host of a fatal party. He had not yet stood before a judge, had not yet been given the chance to defend himself, and yet in the eyes of the public, he was already guilty or innocent depending upon the paper one read. The headlines painted him with cruelty. Fatty's orgy kills girl. Film star held for death of actress. Each word was chosen to provoke, to sell, to feed the appetite of a society both fascinated and horrified by Hollywood. And here we must pause and consider the power of words. A life ended quietly in a hospital bed, yet by morning it was resounding across the nation as a scandal. The truth of what had happened remained uncertain, hidden behind conflicting accounts. But the newspapers required no certainty. They required only sensation. Each phrase, each distorted detail, spread farther than Virginia's own voice had ever reached in life. What must it mean to have one's name carried so widely only after death, and carried in ways that distort rather than reveal? Perhaps it is one of humanity's cruelties, that fame is so often born from tragedy rather than triumph. In the days that followed, the press coverage grew more frenzied. Sketches of the hotel suite were printed, diagrams of the supposed events, testimonies from witnesses given before they were even sworn in. Delmont, her companion, was quoted at length, her words fierce, accusing Arbuckle of brutality. Other voices contradicted her, insisting that Virginia had been ill before the party, that she had long suffered from internal troubles. Doctors issued statements, some declaring that her bladder had ruptured from force, others claiming that illness alone explained her decline. The contradictions did not weaken the story. They strengthened it, for ambiguity is fertile soil for speculation. For Virginia's memory, however, each headline was another distortion. Few asked about her career, her early struggles, her ambition. Few wrote of the orphan girl who had posed for photographs in Chicago, who had walked the uncertain path to Hollywood. Instead, they described her in terms of her death. Arbuckle's victim, the girl of the party. Her individuality dissolved beneath these phrases. She became a cautionary tale, a name invoked in sermons about morality, in conversations about the dangers of fame, in debates about the future of Hollywood itself. The speed with which the world claimed her story is staggering. From her last breath to the first headlines, only hours passed. From headlines to national sensation, only a day. And within a week, she was no longer a woman remembered by friends, but a symbol discussed by strangers across the country. One wonders what she would have thought. Had she been able to see how her death was used, how her name was twisted into a weapon, how she was remembered not as she was, but as the world required her to be. The presses clattered through the night, their rhythm unceasing, filling the streets with papers that carried her story farther and farther. Newsboys called out the scandal, their voices shrill in the foggy mornings. "Arbuckle girl dead! Read all about it!" Strangers picked up the papers, sipped their coffee, shook their heads, whispered to one another. Some condemned Hollywood, some pitied Virginia, some laughed at Arbuckle's downfall. All participated in the transformation of her life into a tale of spectacle. And so we close this part with an image not of Virginia herself, but of the world that claimed her. The presses thunder, the ink dries, the papers are stacked high and carried into the streets. A boy with tousled hair and a worn cap runs along a curb, shouting the headline to passers-by. The fog of San Francisco wraps around him, but the words cut through clear, "Fatty Arbuckle in Scandal." The echo of his cry fades into the distance, leaving behind the uneasy knowledge that Virginia's story has been taken, reshaped, and scattered, like leaves in a restless wind. The cry of the newsboy fades into the fog, the paper clutched in the hands of strangers, and from those ink-stained headlines, the story moves inexorably to its next stage. When rumor and speculation are not enough, the machinery of justice must be set in motion, and so it was that Roscoe Arbuckle, once beloved for his laughter, found himself seized by the stern hand of the law. He was arrested, charged with a crime he swore he had not committed, and led into a world far colder than the bright lights of the theater. The courtroom, heavy with smoke and filled with restless eyes, became the stage upon which this tragedy continued to unfold. The contrast could not have been sharper. Arbuckle, immense in body, sat heavily in the defendant's chair, his frame filling the space as though he were a giant forced into too small a room. The man who had once somersaulted across screens, who had made crowds roar with childlike glee, now sat motionless, his laughter silenced. Before him, a judge presided with stern face, while lawyers sharpened their words like blades. Around them, spectators filled every seat, their breath mingling in a haze of expectation, their whispers betraying the thrill of seeing a famous man brought low. Beyond the walls, reporters gathered with sharpened pencils, their ears straining to catch every phrase, their minds already crafting tomorrow's headlines. And yet, most haunting of all was the absence. The absence of Virginia, whose stillness in the grave left a silence that no testimony could fill. She was the reason for it all, yet she was not there. Only her image, her name, her memory summoned by others, carried the weight of accusation. The lawyers spoke for her. The witnesses claimed to know her truth. The newspapers painted her in one light or another. But she herself was silent. In that silence lay the tragedy. Her voice forever gone, replaced by the voices of strangers. The prosecution thundered that Arbuckle had assaulted her, that his indulgence, his appetites, had destroyed her. They pointed to Delmont's testimony, to the words of those who had seen Virginia collapse, to the doctors who claimed her body bore signs of violence. The defense countered with equal force, declaring that her death was the result of illness, that her body had long been weakened, that Arbuckle had been no more than a bystander in a cruel twist of fate. Each side spoke with certainty, yet their certainties contradicted one another, leaving the jurors to navigate a labyrinth of confusion. Arbuckle himself sat silently for much of it, his expression solemn, sometimes weary, sometimes stricken. Those who had once cheered his antics upon the screen now gazed at him with suspicion, wondering if behind the mask of comedy there lurked something darker. He protested his innocence, but the words seemed small against the tidal wave of accusation. Fame, which had once shielded him, now magnified every gesture, every word, every silence. The public no longer saw him as a man. They saw him as a symbol of excess, of the dangers of Hollywood's hidden world. The courtroom itself became a theater. Testimonies were delivered like performances, each witness stepping forward as though to play a role. Some trembled, others spoke with rehearsed conviction. Doctors contradicted one another, their science transformed into spectacle. Friends of Virginia recalled her pain, some insisting she had accused Arbuckle directly, others denying it. The jurors shifted in their seats, caught between sympathy and doubt, their own minds shaped as much by the headlines outside as by the words within. The gavel struck to restore order again and again, but the murmurs never fully ceased. One can imagine the atmosphere. The air thick with tobacco smoke, the shuffling of papers, the scratching of pens, the occasional gasp from the crowd when a new accusation was made. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with onlookers, eager to catch a glimpse of Arbuckle as he entered or left, their eyes filled with curiosity and condemnation alike. Each day of testimony was followed by columns in the press, each column feeding the hunger of a public, eager for both justice and entertainment. And yet, beneath the thunder of accusation and defense, the tragedy of Virginia lingered, unsolved. Was she a victim of violence or of illness? Was Arbuckle guilty or unjustly accused? The trial offered no clarity, only deeper uncertainty. Each piece of evidence seemed to dissolve upon inspection, each testimony contradicted by another. The more the lawyers spoke, the less certain the truth became. It is here that we must pause and reflect upon the nature of justice when it collides with fame. For in such cases, the courtroom is not merely a place of law. It is a stage for society's fears and desires. Arbuckle's bulk became a symbol of indulgence, his laughter a mask hiding corruption, Virginia's beauty a symbol of innocence lost or of temptation punished. The jurors were asked not only to weigh evidence, but to navigate a web of symbols that carried meanings far beyond the facts. How does one judge fairly when every detail has been magnified, distorted, transformed into myth? As the days turned into weeks, Arbuckle's face grew more drawn. The newspapers carried sketches of him, each artist interpreting his features differently, some portraying him as cruel, others as pitiable. The man himself seemed less real than the image of him that was consumed by the world. He had become both villain and victim, depending upon the teller, and in that paradox he lost the possibility of being understood as simply human. And always beneath it all was the absence of Virginia, her voice never heard, her presence never felt, her story told only by others. Did the jurors think of her as they listened to the lawyers argue? Did they picture her lying upon the hospital bed, her eyes closed, her body weakened? Or did they think only of Arbuckle, the man before them, whose fate was theirs to decide? Perhaps they thought of both, caught in the tension between the living and the dead, between the silence of one and the pleas of the other. As this part of the story draws to a close, the courtroom remains suspended in uncertainty. The gavel strikes, the session ends, the crowd disperses into the fog outside, their voices rising in speculation. Arbuckle remains, heavy and still, awaiting the next day's testimony. Virginia remains, absent yet ever present, her name spoken again and again by voices not her own. The smoke lingers in the rafters, the papers shuffle into silence, and the gavel's echo fades. The image unresolved, a courtroom heavy with shadows, the figure of a man sitting alone at the defendant's table, and in the silence beyond, the memory of a woman whose cries still echo faintly in the distance. The echo of the gavel fades into the smoky rafters, and when the sound dissolves, it is not resolution that follows, but the promise of repetition. For the trial of Roscoe Arbuckle did not conclude in a single act, nor even in two, but stretched across 3 performances, each one more weary than the last, as if justice itself had become a play whose ending could never quite be written. The first trial ended not with clarity, but with division. The jurors, unable to reach agreement, their minds caught in the web of contradictions that had been spun around them. They had listened to witnesses, weighed evidence, studied testimony, and yet the scales never balanced. Some believed Arbuckle guilty beyond question, others saw only doubt, and so they dispersed unresolved, leaving the world outside hungrier than before. When the second trial was convened, the public returned with greater fervor, for nothing whets the appetite of curiosity more than uncertainty. If the first had promised answers but delivered only confusion, perhaps the second would bring closure. Once again the courtroom filled, the smoke hung thick, the jurors sat solemn, and the witnesses paraded forward as though stepping onto a stage. They repeated their words, though not always exactly. Memories shifted, contradictions deepened. Some voices grew louder, emboldened by the spectacle, while others weakened under the weight of scrutiny. Doctors clashed, one declaring Virginia's death the result of violence, another insisting it was illness alone. Friends contradicted one another, loyalty pulling them in opposite directions. And Arbuckle, weary yet defiant, remained at the center, his broad frame and solemn eyes a constant reminder of the gravity of it all. Again the jury withdrew, and again they returned without resolution. The second trial ended, like the first, in deadlock. For Arbuckle, it was a continuation of limbo. For Virginia's memory, it was another distortion. The public, instead of being satisfied, grew even more frenzied. Each hung jury only fueled speculation. Each failure to convict or acquit deepened the sense that truth itself was slipping further away. Newspapers seized upon the stalemate with relish, filling their columns with speculation, caricature, and accusation. Sermons were preached, debates held, Hollywood condemned. And yet, through it all, the silence of Virginia's absence remained. She was spoken of constantly, yet never heard. The third trial, convened in early 1922, carried with it the weight of exhaustion. The public was restless, the courts weary, Arbuckle himself diminished by months of scrutiny and disgrace. Still, the machinery of justice ground on. Once again the jurors were seated, the lawyers sharpened their arguments, the witnesses repeated their stories. But by this third attempt, something had shifted. Perhaps it was the weariness of repetition. Or perhaps it was the recognition that the evidence, however loudly proclaimed, remained inconclusive. When the jury returned this time, it was not with division, but with a unanimous acquittal. Arbuckle was declared innocent of the charges against him. Yet even in acquittal, there was no true victory. The jurors, in an extraordinary gesture, delivered not only a verdict, but a statement, declaring that a great injustice had been done to Arbuckle, that he should never have been brought to trial at all. They sought to restore his honor, to wash away the stain of accusation. And yet, as with so much in life, the gesture came too late. His career had already been destroyed, his films withdrawn, his reputation shattered. Innocence in the eyes of the law could not undo guilt in the eyes of the public. It is here that we must pause and reflect on the nature of justice. What is justice? When it arrives too late to restore what has been lost. Arbuckle was declared innocent, yet his name remained forever tied to scandal. Virginia was declared a victim, yet her life was reduced to headlines and courtroom debates. Neither received true justice, for justice requires not only verdicts, but remembrance, compassion, understanding. And in the clamor of trials and headlines, such qualities were scarce. Consider the atmosphere of those months. 3 trials, each one filled with smoke, with murmurs, with the clatter of typewriters, the scratching of pens, the same witnesses repeating their lines, the same evidence held up again and again, the same jurors struggling with contradictions. It must have felt, to those within the courtroom, like a circle that could never be broken, a play destined to repeat until exhaustion ended it. For the public, each trial was entertainment, another act in the ongoing drama. For Arbuckle, it was torment, his life suspended, his future erased. For Virginia, it was silence, her name spoken endlessly yet herself forgotten. The trials revealed more than the uncertainty of evidence. They revealed the hunger of society to shape stories into symbols. Arbuckle became the symbol of Hollywood's excess. Virginia, the symbol of its corruption or its victimhood. Neither was permitted the complexity of being human. Each was transformed into a lesson, a warning, a piece of moral theater. And perhaps that is the truest tragedy of all, not merely that a woman died young, nor that a man's career was destroyed, but that both were consumed by the public's need for certainty, for spectacle, for stories that comforted their fears. When the 3rd trial ended and Arbuckle was acquitted, the courtroom emptied for the last time. The smoke cleared, the papers were shuffled into files, the jurors went home. But outside, the world did not forget. Arbuckle's name was never again spoken without mention of scandal. Virginia's death was never again remembered without suspicion. The trials had ended, but the story lived on, unresolved. And so we leave this part of the tale not with the gavel's final strike, but with its echo fading into silence. The courtroom grows empty, the chairs are stacked, the air grows still. Yet in that stillness the memory of Virginia lingers, and the image of Arbuckle remains. Both are suspended in history, their fates bound together, their lives reshaped by 3 trials that answered nothing and resolved even less. The image left unresolved, a jury room door swinging shut, the murmurs of jurors fading, and beyond the window, the city continuing its restless life, unaware that true justice has once again slipped through human hands. The jury room door swings shut, its echo fading into stillness, and in that quiet the final verdict is spoken: innocent. After 3 trials, months of testimony, endless columns of speculation, Roscoe Arbuckle is at last acquitted. The jurors, in their extraordinary declaration, insist that he has suffered a great injustice, that no charge should ever have been laid against him. Their words ring with sincerity, yet they fall into a world already deafened by scandal. For even as the gavel falls in his favor, the shadow upon his name remains, dark and unrelenting, cast not by law but by memory. Arbuckle walks free in the eyes of the court, yet in the eyes of the public he remains guilty, guilty of excess, guilty of corruption, guilty of being the man at the center of a tragedy that no verdict could erase. He leaves the courtroom, his large frame stooped with weariness, his face hollowed by months of strain. Once he was adored, his smile greeted with laughter in theaters across the nation. Now he steps into the daylight as a man disgraced, his films withdrawn, his contracts canceled, his laughter silenced. The studios that had once celebrated his genius turn away from him, unwilling to risk the anger of the public. Hollywood itself, ever quick to protect its image, closes its gates against him. Though declared innocent, he is shunned, his career shattered beyond repair. It is a cruel irony. Acquittal brings not freedom, but exile. And so the question lingers: can innocence declared ever restore innocence perceived? For the law may absolve, But memory does not forget. The newspapers, though forced to report the verdict, continue to whisper. The public, though told of his vindication, continues to doubt. Each time his name is spoken, it is tied to Virginia's death. Each time his films are recalled, it is with the stain of scandal. Arbuckle cannot reclaim the laughter he once gave, for the sound is drowned by suspicion. His name, once a beacon of joy, has become a cautionary tale. Within himself, what must he have felt? Relief at the verdict, certainly, yet also despair at what had been lost. Fame, once so secure, had vanished. Friends had fled, contracts dissolved, audiences turned cold. He had been beloved, but love that depends upon laughter is fragile, and once laughter dies, love withers. Arbuckle, acquitted yet disgraced, lived thereafter as a man wandering in the ruins of his own success. And what of Virginia in this moment? Though absent, she remained ever present. Her name was invoked even in the declaration of his innocence, for the jurors spoke of her death, insisting that it was a tragedy of illness, not of violence. Yet the public refused such clarity. To them, she remained a victim, though the cause was contested. Some saw her as innocent, destroyed by a man's appetite. Others saw her as reckless, undone by her own choices. In all versions, her humanity was lost. Her life was reduced to her death to a symbol, her symbol to a headline. The verdict did not restore her memory any more than it restored Arbuckle's career. This is the paradox of scandal. It consumes both the accused and the victim, leaving neither whole. Arbuckle, though cleared, could never again be simply a comedian. Virginia, though mourned, could never again be remembered simply as a woman. Both became figures in a morality tale written by others, their lives reshaped by a public hungry for certainty in a world that offered none. It is worth pausing to consider how history holds such figures. When we think of Arbuckle now, do we remember the man who danced and tumbled with remarkable grace, who made audiences roar with joy? Or do we remember only the scandal, the trial, the headlines? And when we think of Virginia, do we recall the orphan girl from Chicago, the model, the actress striving for recognition? Or do we remember only the hospital bed, the accusations, the silence of her death? The human beings vanish, the symbols remain. Arbuckle attempted, in the years that followed, to reclaim something of his former life. He sought work, directing under a false name, occasionally appearing in minor roles. But the doors of stardom were closed to him, and the laughter that had once filled theaters at his presence now seemed to mock him in memory. He lived under the weight of disgrace, his health failing, his spirit dimmed. Though the law had acquitted him, the world had condemned him, and there was no verdict to reverse that. The irony of his fate is sharpened by the reality that his artistry was genuine. He had been among the most gifted comedians of his generation, his movements astonishing for a man of his size, his timing impeccable, his invention boundless. Charlie Chaplin himself admired him, acknowledging his brilliance. Yet brilliance is no shield against scandal. The shadow of Virginia's death fell across him, and no light could dispel it. And so, as we close this part of the tale, we leave Arbuckle not in triumph, but in silence. The curtain has fallen on his trial, the jurors have spoken, the gavel has struck. Innocence has been declared, yet no applause follows, only the rustle of newspapers and the murmur of doubt. He walks from the courtroom a free man, yet shackled forever by memory, and in the silence behind him, Virginia's absence remains, her name whispered still, her story unresolved. The image is left unresolved. A theater curtain falling at the end of a performance, the audience uncertain whether to clap or to leave in silence, the stage darkening, the laughter gone. The curtain falls upon the courtroom stage, its heavy fabric sighing into stillness, and when the darkness settles, we are left with silence. But beyond the silence there remain voices, not those of lawyers or jurors, nor the shrill cries of newspapers, but the quieter recollections of those who had known Virginia in life. For if we turn away from the gavel and the ink, we may glimpse her not as the symbol she was forced to become, but as the woman she truly was. Fragile, determined, full of longing, and sometimes of laughter. Friends remembered her kindness, her moments of generosity, the way she could light a room with a smile even when her own fortunes were uncertain. They spoke of a woman who had endured hardship with remarkable resilience, who had known hunger and loneliness, yet still pursued beauty. In her presence, there was a mixture of vulnerability and strength, as though she knew well how fleeting life could be and sought to savor what joy it offered. She loved music, they said, and dancing. She had a voice that could laugh with a band in one moment and fall into quiet reflection the next. Her struggles, too, were known. She had been marked by poverty, by the absence of parents, by the instability of life as a model and actress. There were times when her health faltered, when pain interrupted her ambitions, when her body reminded her that it could not always serve her dreams. Yet she pressed onward, determined to find recognition in a world that valued women for their appearance more than their depth. To those who knew her well, she was not merely a face upon a screen or a name in a gossip column. She was a companion, a friend, a woman of both sorrow and joy. It is important to linger here, for too often Virginia is remembered only in death, only as the woman whose passing destroyed another's career. But she was alive before that, and in her life she sought love, work, and meaning. Friends recalled her affection for Henry Lehrman, the director with whom she shared years of companionship. Their relationship, like so many in Hollywood, was complicated, but there was no doubt of her devotion. She spoke of marriage, of a future built together, of hopes that stretched beyond the uncertainty of auditions. That such hopes were cut short makes her story all the more tragic. Imagine her in those quieter moments, away from parties and cameras. Perhaps she sat with a small group of friends in a modest apartment, the night air drifting in through an open window, the city humming outside. She might have shared stories of her childhood, of the loss that had marked her early years, of the dreams that carried her forward. She might have laughed at her own missteps, her face glowing in the lamplight, her hands gesturing with animation. Such images remind us that she was not merely the victim of scandal, but a woman who lived, loved, and laughed, even if briefly. How often do we forget this? When we recall those who have been consumed by history. We speak of their deaths, their scandals, their legacies, and we forget the texture of their living. We forget the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their presence, the ordinariness of their days. Yet it is in those ordinary details that true remembrance lies. Virginia's tragedy is not only that she died young, but that her life was overshadowed, that her memory was reduced to a single event. To restore her humanity is to imagine her again in these moments of living, to allow her laughter to echo once more. And perhaps there is wisdom in remembering her laughter, for laughter is both fragile and enduring. It rises quickly and fades swiftly, yet in memory it can linger, echoing long after the moment has passed. Virginia's laughter, recalled by those who knew her, was said to be light and full of life. Even in hardship, she could find reason to smile, to share joy with those around her. That such laughter should end in silence is a sorrow beyond words, yet the memory of it offers a form of defiance against the cruelty of scandal. Her friends, when asked later, spoke not only of her beauty, but of her warmth, her ability to draw others close. They remembered her as someone who sought connection, who longed for belonging. This longing is not surprising for one who grew up without the steady presence of parents, who was forced to seek family in friends and companions. In this, she was like so many who arrive in Hollywood, carrying dreams, searching for recognition, yearning for community. She was not unique in this, and yet her story, because of its tragic ending, became uniquely remembered. And so, in this part of her story, let us allow her to be remembered not only as a victim, but as a woman who lived. Let us picture her not in pain, but in joy, her hair catching the sunlight, her dress stirring in the breeze, her eyes alive with hope. Let us imagine her stepping onto a film set, nervous yet eager, her heart quickening at the chance to be seen, her body learning the rhythms of silent performance. Let us hear again the echo of her laughter in a small apartment, the clinking of glasses raised in friendship, the sound of footsteps on a wooden floor as she danced to music played from a phonograph. These are the images that preserve her humanity, the details that restore her to herself. The scandal will always remain, the trials, the headlines, the accusations. But beyond them, or perhaps beneath them, there is this: a woman who sought to live fully despite her hardships, who found moments of joy even when life seemed fragile, who dreamed of being remembered not as she died but as she lived. In honoring that, we resist the simplification that history so often demands. And so we end this part not with silence, but with the faint echo of her laughter, rising gently into the air, light and fleeting yet enduring in memory. It drifts beyond the room, beyond the city, into the night. A reminder that even in tragedy, joy once existed, and that to remember it is to honor the fullness of a life. The sound of her laughter lingers, faint and tender, drifting outward like a candle flame trembling in the dark. But as it fades, we are drawn into another chamber altogether, one less filled with warmth and more with debate. For when a death is clouded by mystery, when whispers of violence and illness intermingle, there are always those who seek to explain, to assign cause, to hold a body up to the cold scrutiny of science. So it was with Virginia Rappe. Even as her friends recalled her kindness, even as her laughter echoed in memory, physicians and commentators gathered in courtrooms and in newspapers, weighing her death not as a human tragedy, but as a medical puzzle. The doctors could not agree. Some swore that her bladder had ruptured from external force, a violent injury inflicted upon her by another. Others insisted that her frailty, her long history of abdominal troubles, had left her vulnerable, that even a small strain or the pressure of illness could have caused the same result. Autopsy reports were cited, then questioned, their conclusions both definitive and uncertain. Each statement was seized upon by lawyers, each contradiction magnified by the press. The truth of her body became less a fact than a battlefield, upon which reputations and verdicts would be won or lost. Peritonitis, they said. That much was clear, but peritonitis is not a cause, only a description of the body's suffering, the inflammation that follows a rupture, the fire that spreads through the abdomen until it consumes the whole. What caused the rupture? That was the question upon which the scandal hinged. Some claimed violence, some claimed neglect, some pointed to a history of illness worsened by years of hardship. The evidence lay upon the examining table, yet it yielded no certain answer. Imagine the room where doctors gathered around her body, the air cool, the light stark, the instruments cold against her skin, her face still, her beauty now unresponsive, her body reduced to specimen. They leaned close, murmuring to one another, tracing with gloved hands the marks of pain. One concluded that rough handling had torn her within. Another shook his head, insisting it was illness alone. Their words, recorded in notes and testimonies, became part of the storm, each side claiming the authority of science, yet contradicting the other. And beneath it all, the woman herself was lost, her humanity subsumed by the arguments over her flesh. Even beyond the courtroom, the debate continued. Newspapers printed long columns filled with medical speculation, some written by doctors, others by journalists who fancied themselves experts. The public devoured these details, as though understanding the precise mechanism of her death might satisfy their hunger for certainty. Was she assaulted? Was she frail? Was she a victim of cruelty or of fate? Each theory said as much about the anxieties of society as it did about Virginia. In a time of prohibition, when indulgence was hidden but rampant, to declare her death the result of debauchery confirmed suspicions of Hollywood's corruption. To declare it illness alone was to deflate the scandal, something the papers had little desire to do, and so her body became not only a medical specimen, but a symbol upon which society projected its fears. If she was violated, then Hollywood was guilty of moral collapse. If she was ill, then perhaps she was reckless, another woman who had not guarded her health, another example of feminine weakness. In neither version was she allowed dignity. She was either an angel destroyed or a body that had failed. Her complexity, her laughter, her dreams, all were set aside in favor of diagnosis. It is here that we must pause and reflect on the nature of such debates. When a life has ended, what good does it do to argue endlessly over the precise cause? Certainly justice requires some clarity, yet beyond justice, there is remembrance. And remembrance is not built upon the exact shape of a rupture, but upon the person who lived. To reduce Virginia to her peritonitis, to her ruptured bladder, is to forget that she was more than her body. She was a soul who danced, who posed, who longed to be seen. What do we gain by knowing the mechanism of her death if we forget the music of her life? Still, the doctors' voices cannot be silenced, for they were the ones who stood at the edge of her mystery. Their disagreements reveal not only the limits of medicine in that era, but also the fragility of truth when it becomes a weapon. Each physician who spoke in court must have felt the weight of history pressing upon his words. Did they speak honestly of what they saw, or did they shade their testimony to suit the side that had called them? We cannot know. We can only note that their contradictions deepened the fog, leaving the jurors more uncertain, the public more divided, and Virginia more obscured. Some have since suggested that Virginia suffered from chronic illnesses long before the party at the St. Francis. Accounts mention repeated hospitalizations, lingering pain, complications that may have left her vulnerable to just such a rupture. Others insist that her decline was sudden, inexplicable, except by violence. Even modern commentators disagree, for the evidence has long since crumbled, the reports incomplete, the details inconsistent. More than a century later, her cause of death remains unresolved, and perhaps it always will. What, then, are we left with? We are left with ambiguity. We are left with the knowledge that even science cannot always deliver certainty, that even doctors disagree, that truth itself can vanish when too many voices shout over it. And in that ambiguity lies a deeper truth, that we cannot know everything, that the mysteries of life and death sometimes remain hidden, and that to demand clarity where none exists may only do harm. As we close this part of her story, we leave behind the cold instruments and the murmuring physicians. The hospital chamber grows still again, the reports gathered into files, the testimony recorded in transcripts. But the image that lingers is not of documents or diagnoses. It is of Virginia herself, her eyes closed, her face calm, her laughter still echoing faintly in memory, while others argue endlessly over the cause of her silence. The image unresolved, a doctor's uncertain eyes looking down, unable to say with finality what is past, while outside the world clamors for an answer that may never come. The doctor's uncertain eyes linger a moment, then drift away, and in the silence that follows, the voices of medicine fade into something louder, less precise, but more consuming. For when ambiguity reigns, society rushes to fill it with certainty of its own. And so Virginia's death, unresolved in the chambers of science, was carried into the greater chamber of public opinion, where it became not merely a tragedy nor a scandal, but a symbol of the times. America, in the early 1920s, was already caught in a storm of change. Prohibition had been declared, cities swelled with jazz and speakeasies, women cut their hair and shortened their skirts, and whispers of decadence and moral decline filled the air. Into this unsettled world, the story of Virginia Rappe fell like a spark into dry tinder. Preachers spoke of it from their pulpits, their voices rising over congregations with warnings that Hollywood had become a den of sin. Here, they said, was proof. A woman dead after a party filled with liquor, a famous comedian at the center, a hotel suite transformed into a modern Babylon. Temperance advocates seized upon her death as a lesson, declaring that alcohol, though banned by law, was still destroying lives. Politicians pointed to the scandal as justification for moral reform, calling for stricter oversight of films, of actors, of the entire industry that had so captivated the public imagination. The press, already eager for sensation, fed these anxieties with headlines that blurred fact and invention, their ink spreading suspicion far beyond the courtroom. And what of ordinary people, reading the stories at their breakfast tables or listening to the gossip in streetcars? Some clucked their tongues in disapproval, certain that Virginia had been a victim of Hollywood's corruption. Others whispered that she had brought misfortune upon herself, a cautionary tale of ambition gone astray. Many felt both at once, pity and condemnation, fascination and revulsion. For such is the power of scandal, it invites judgment while offering no safe ground upon which to stand. The broader cultural moment only magnified this hunger. Prohibition had created a world where indulgence was both condemned and craved. Liquor, hidden in back rooms and poured in secret glasses, had become a symbol of rebellion, of pleasure defying the law. In such a climate, the notion of a party filled with champagne, held by one of the nation's most famous comedians, struck the public imagination with irresistible force. Virginia's death confirmed what many already suspected, that behind the glamour of the silver screen lay vice, indulgence, and ruin. Whether true or not mattered little. It was the image that endured. Consider the irony. In life, Virginia had struggled for recognition, often overlooked, her name misspelled, her roles minor. In death, she became famous not for what she had done, but for what she represented. She was no longer Virginia, the orphan from Chicago, the model, the actress who longed for greater roles. She was transformed into a symbol of a society's fears, a name invoked in sermons, in editorials, in conversations about morality. The complexity of her life was lost beneath the weight of meaning assigned to her by others. And what of Arbuckle? His own ruin became entwined with hers. Where once he had been adored for his laughter, now he was condemned as the face of excess. His bulk, once a source of humor, was now described as grotesque, a physical emblem of indulgence. The very qualities that had made him beloved were reinterpreted as evidence of corruption. In the public's imagination, his size became not simply a body, but a metaphor. Hollywood itself, bloated, gluttonous, out of control. Thus Arbuckle, like Virginia, ceased to be himself. He became a symbol of a larger cultural panic. This transformation reveals something unsettling about human societies. How easily individuals are stripped of their humanity when they serve as vessels for collective fear. Virginia's name became shorthand for the dangers of feminine ambition, of women stepping too freely into a world of parties and fame. Arbuckle's name became shorthand for the dangers of masculine indulgence, of men whose wealth and power placed them above morality. Each ceased to be a person, each became a lesson. And in this process, truth was not revealed but concealed. If one listens closely to the sermons, the editorials, the conversations of that time, one hears less about Virginia herself and more about what she symbolized. She was invoked as evidence of Hollywood's decadence, of alcohol's poison, of women's vulnerability, of men's corruption. Rarely was she invoked as herself. Rarely was Arbuckle discussed as a man who might have been innocent, flawed, but human. The scandal became a mirror in which society saw its own anxieties, magnified and distorted, and the reflection was mistaken for reality. It is worth pausing to ask, was Virginia's death the spark that ignited this panic, or merely the mirror in which fears already present were reflected? America, in the 1920s, was already uneasy. Prohibition had created both defiance and corruption. Women's suffrage had altered the balance of power, and the sight of women drinking, smoking, dancing unsettled many. The rising power of Hollywood, with its stars adored by millions, threatened older forms of authority. In such a world, the death of a young actress at a party was not simply an event, it was a revelation, proof of what people already believed or feared to be true. And yet, amidst this clamor, Virginia herself was lost. The person who had once laughed, who had once dreamed, was erased beneath sermons and headlines. Her death became a parable, her name an argument, her story a cautionary tale. It is this, perhaps, that deepens the tragedy. Not only that she died young, but that in death she was denied remembrance as herself. Let us close this part of her story with the sound of glasses clinking, not in celebration, but in hidden rooms, speakeasies filled with laughter and smoke. Outside, sermons thunder and newspapers shout, but inside, people drink and dance, defying the law, ignoring the cautionary tales. The clink of empty glasses echoes like a question. Did Virginia's death change anything? Or was it only a mirror held up to a society already trembling with its own contradictions? The clinking of empty glasses fades, their sound echoing like a warning in the dim rooms of speakeasies, and from that unsettled music, we follow the heavy figure of Roscoe Arbuckle into the long aftermath of disgrace. Though acquitted in the court of law, though declared innocent by a jury that sought to restore his honor, the verdict could not undo the judgment of the public. Once he had been beloved for his laughter, a man who filled theaters with joy. Now he walked through a world that greeted him with suspicion, derision, or silence. Fame had lifted him high, but scandal had cast him down, and no gavel could lift him up again. The studios that had once courted him now turned their faces away. Paramount, which had paid him a fortune for his art, canceled contracts, withdrew films, and erased his presence from their ledgers. Distributors refused to screen his comedies, fearful of public outrage. Even audiences who had once roared with laughter grew uneasy, unwilling to separate the innocent man from the accused figure they had seen in the headlines. Arbuckle's name had become poison, and in an industry where reputation mattered as much as talent, poison could not be cleansed. He sought a way back, but each attempt faltered. Under assumed names, he directed films, quietly lending his genius to productions that carried no trace of his identity. He still possessed the gift of timing, the imagination for comedy, the ability to make motion itself a form of poetry. But these gifts were hidden, buried beneath pseudonyms, invisible to the audiences who had once adored him. To live in disguise is to live only half a life, and Arbuckle, once so radiant with laughter, now moved like a man carrying invisible chains. The press, which had once thrived on his scandal, rarely allowed him respite. When his name appeared again, it was not for his artistry but for reminders of disgrace. Fatty, the affectionate name once shouted in joy, now carried bitterness, mockery, disdain. He was not simply Roscoe Arbuckle, a man. He was a symbol of shame. Even when jurors declared his innocence, the world would not forgive. In the eyes of society, he had become larger than himself, a warning, a scandal, a lesson, and no verdict could free him from that role. What must he have felt in those years of exile? Imagine him in a quiet room, far from the lights of the studio, his broad body slumped in a chair, his eyes heavy with weariness. Perhaps he recalled the roar of audiences, the joy of children, the thrill of creation. Perhaps he tried to laugh again to summon the old magic, only to find the sound hollow, echoing back from empty walls. For laughter, once born of freedom, cannot easily return in chains. Arbuckle lived, but he no longer lived as himself. And yet, those who knew him spoke of his gentleness, his generosity, his kindness even in the face of ruin. Friends defended him, colleagues remembered his talent, but the weight of scandal was greater than any loyalty. Hollywood itself, eager to protect its image, left him behind, and he became a ghost wandering its boulevards, visible yet unseen. His health began to decline, his spirit weakened, his laughter muted. He had been one of the first true giants of screen comedy, but his giant's fall left him diminished, a man remembered not for joy, but for disgrace. Meanwhile, Virginia's memory remained entangled with his. Each mention of her name recalled him. Each mention of him recalled her. They were bound together forever, though in life they had shared only a fleeting encounter. She, dead at 29, was remembered not for her laughter, but for her death. He, ruined at 34, lived on but in the shadow of her absence. Their lives, so different in origin, so unequal in power, became one story in the eyes of the world, a story of scandal, of excess, of ruin. Neither could escape the other. Years passed. Arbuckle continued to work in obscurity, directing under false names, scraping together what he could. At times he dreamed of returning, of standing once again before the cameras, of reclaiming the laughter that had once defined him. In the late 1920s, after years of silence, he was at last given a chance to return to acting. He appeared in short films, his presence still capable of charm, his timing still flawless. For a brief moment it seemed that the world might allow him back, that laughter might be his once more. But time had changed him. The years of disgrace had taken their toll. His body, already heavy, grew weaker. His spirit, already battered, carried the marks of sorrow. In 1933, at the age of 46, Roscoe Arbuckle died suddenly of a heart attack. The news carried a bitter symmetry. His death came just hours after he had signed a contract to return fully to film, his first opportunity in over a decade to reclaim the career that scandal had stolen. He had been given back the possibility of laughter, but only at the threshold of death. Thus Arbuckle's story ended as Virginia's had, abruptly, prematurely, tinged with tragedy. Neither lived to see their lives remembered as they might have wished. He was mourned by friends, remembered by colleagues for his talent, but the public memory remained darkened. Even today, his name is spoken less for his artistry than for the scandal that destroyed him. Like Virginia, he became a cautionary tale rather than a remembered soul. And so we must reflect on how scandal destroys more than it intends. Virginia's death silenced her life. Arbuckle's trials silenced his career. Both were consumed, their humanity lost beneath layers of meaning imposed by others. One became the symbol of feminine vulnerability, the other of masculine excess, and in both cases, the truth was obscured. Perhaps this is the greatest tragedy of all, not that they died or were ruined, but that they were never again allowed to be remembered as themselves. As this part of the story closes, let us picture Arbuckle not in the courtroom, nor in the shadows of disgrace, but as he once was, a comedian upon the screen, moving with astonishing grace, his laughter genuine, his art undeniable. And let us picture Virginia not in the hospital bed, nor beneath the headlines, but as she once was, a young woman laughing among friends, her eyes alight, her dreams still alive. For in these images, fleeting though they may be, we reclaim something of their humanity. The reel breaks now, the film fluttering in the projector, the image dissolving into blank light. The sound of laughter fades into silence, leaving behind only memory, fragile and unresolved. The reel flutters, the image dissolves into blank light, and when the glow fades, we are left not in a theater, not in a courtroom, but in a quieter place, the earth itself, where Virginia was laid to rest. For all the noise that followed her death, all the thunder of presses and the murmur of jurors, her body was placed into silence. She was buried in Los Angeles, far from the city of her birth, far from the marble halls of the St. Francis Hotel, far from the laughter and the pain that had defined her brief life. In the end, she was returned to the stillness that all must one day enter, her name carved in stone, her grave an unassuming patch of earth. For years, her resting place was neglected. Weeds crept across the soil, the stone grew weathered and faint, and few came to visit. The world, eager for her story in life, eager for her scandal in death, quickly forgot her in repose. Arbuckle's name continued to draw attention, his scandal invoked again and again in books, in articles, in whispered conversations. Virginia, meanwhile, was left behind. She had been the center of a storm, but when the storm moved on, little remained. An orphan in childhood, she became, in death, an orphan again in memory, untended, forgotten. Yet memory is a tide, retreating and returning. Decades after her burial, her grave was rediscovered. Visitors, drawn by curiosity or compassion, sought her out. They placed flowers upon the earth, bright against the faded stone, as if to restore to her in death some of the gentleness that had been denied her in life. Historians and film lovers wrote her name anew, not as scandal, but as remembrance. Slowly, she emerged again from obscurity, not whole, but present. She became once more not only the girl at Arbuckle's party, but Virginia Rappe, a woman whose brief life deserved more than scandal. Imagine the scene: a quiet cemetery, the air heavy with the scent of grass and stone, the sound of birds mingling with the distant hum of the city. A visitor kneels, arranging roses upon her grave, reading her name aloud as though to call her back into memory. The earth accepts the flowers silently. The stone endures. The visitor rises, and in that moment, Virginia is remembered not as a headline, but as a human being. Such acts of remembrance may seem small, but they resist the erasure of time. They declare that beneath the scandal there was a life, and that life mattered. In the years since, her story has continued to surface, retold in films, in books, in articles. Each retelling reshapes her, sometimes gently, sometimes crudely. Yet within these retellings there is also a yearning to restore dignity, to reclaim her from the noise of scandal. Scholars point to her hardships, her ambition, her beauty, her resilience. They remind us that she was not simply the victim of a single event, but a woman who lived in a world that gave her little and demanded much. Still, there is sadness in the fact that remembrance often comes too late. Flowers upon a grave cannot heal the wounds of a life overshadowed. Visitors whispering her name cannot undo the headlines that once mocked her. Yet there is also a quiet defiance in such gestures. To remember her as more than scandal is to resist the simplifications of history. It is to honor her laughter, her kindness, her dreams, even if they were cut short. And so we must reflect: how many others have been forgotten, their lives consumed by scandal or erased by indifference? Virginia is remembered precisely because her death was sensational. Yet countless others lived and died in obscurity, their names lost to time. To remember her is to acknowledge not only her own story, but the fragility of memory itself. We remember what is repeated, and we forget what is neglected. Her rediscovered grave stands as both a monument and a warning. At times, film historians have sought to place her within the broader story of cinema. They note how her death altered Hollywood, how the scandal shaped the industry's morality clauses, how Arbuckle's ruin warned studios of the dangers of indulgence. But beyond these institutional shifts, there remains Virginia herself. Not an industry, not a clause, but a woman who sought to live and whose life ended too soon. In visiting her grave, in laying flowers, in speaking her name, we resist the erasure of the person beneath the symbol. Let us pause to imagine her there, beneath the earth, as though asleep, her story drifting upward through the grass. Above her, the city of Los Angeles hums, unaware of her presence, yet bound to her memory. Cars pass, buildings rise, generations move through their lives, and still she rests. In that resting, perhaps there is peace at last. For though the world forgot her, though scandal consumed her, though memory neglected her, the earth does not judge. The earth accepts all equally, the famous and the forgotten, the beloved and the disgraced. Still the flowers matter. They are fragile, fleeting, soon to wither, but they matter. For each petal declares that someone, somewhere, remembered her. Each bloom speaks against silence. Each act of remembrance restores a fragment of her humanity. And perhaps in that act there is a kind of redemption, not for the scandal, not for the trials, but for her memory. As this part of her story closes, let us leave her grave not empty, but adorned with roses. Let us hear the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant sound of footsteps fading along the cemetery path, the quiet presence of earth holding her gently. The scent of flowers lingers in the cool air, a reminder that remembrance, however belated, is still remembrance. The image unresolved, a stone marked with her name, a bouquet resting against it, the sun lowering in the sky, casting long shadows that stretch across the grass like the memories of a life almost forgotten, yet still alive in the hearts of those who choose to remember. The roses upon the stone tremble in the wind, their fragrance drifting upward, and from that quiet resting place our gaze is drawn outward once more, away from the still earth to the restless city that rose around her. For while Virginia lay in silence, Hollywood continued to move, altered by her death and the storm it unleashed. What had been one scandal among many became a turning point, a mirror in which the film industry saw its own vulnerability. The laughter of audiences had turned to outrage, and the studios, fearing ruin, began to weave new rules of conduct, new boundaries for their stars, as though by binding human lives with contracts, they could bind scandal itself. The Arbuckle affair revealed to Hollywood the terrible power of reputation. It showed that the world did not distinguish between the roles played upon the screen and the lives lived beyond it. If a beloved comedian could be destroyed by whispers, then no star was safe. And so the industry, determined to protect itself, began to impose morality clauses upon its actors. Contracts declared that stars must conduct themselves with propriety, that any hint of scandal could end a career. What had once been private life was now bound to the fortunes of the studio. In the name of preservation, freedom was curtailed. Hollywood became not only a place of dreams, but of careful vigilance. Its stars watched as much for their conduct as for their craft. Yet the clauses were not only protective, they were also punitive. They reflected the fear of scandal more than the pursuit of virtue. They were designed not to elevate, but to control, to ensure that the fragile illusion of glamour remained unbroken. Behind the bright lights, actors lived under the shadow of constant scrutiny, their every movement judged, their every choice subject to the court of public opinion. Virginia's death had shown how swiftly judgment could destroy, and Hollywood, rather than challenge that power, sought to appease it. In this way, the scandal shaped not only Arbuckle's fate, but the very structure of the industry. The gossip columns, once peripheral, became central. Studios cultivated them, fed them, manipulated them, knowing that public opinion could make or unmake a star. Scandal had proved its potency, and so it was both feared and used. Hollywood learned to walk a delicate line, promoting romance when it pleased the public, concealing vice when it threatened exposure, and sacrificing individuals when their disgrace seemed too great to contain. The machine grew stronger, but its strength was built upon the fragile lives of those within it. Virginia's story became part of this lesson. Her name was invoked as a caution, her death remembered not for itself, but for what it revealed. She became a ghost haunting the industry, a reminder of how swiftly laughter could turn to condemnation, how a single event could reshape destinies. And yet, in being remembered in this way, she was again stripped of her humanity. Hollywood did not honor her life. It used her death as a warning, a rule, a contract clause. The person was gone. The symbol remained. It is worth reflecting on how powerfully gossip shapes not only reputations, but entire systems. A whisper in a hotel corridor, a rumor in a newspaper can topple careers and alter industries. Arbuckle's laughter was silenced not by verdict, but by gossip. Virginia's life was overshadowed not by truth, but by rumor. The industry itself bent under the weight of gossip, reshaping its laws to appease an audience that demanded purity, but delighted in scandal. This contradiction is at the heart of Hollywood, a place that thrives upon dreams, yet is ruled by suspicion. And what of the public who consumed these stories, who judged, who demanded both entertainment and virtue? They too were changed. They learned to watch not only the films but the lives of those who made them. The audience became voyeurs, seeking glimpses into private affairs, delighting in both triumph and downfall. Scandal became entertainment, as much a part of cinema as the films themselves. In this sense, Virginia's death did not simply alter Hollywood. It altered the very relationship between star and spectator. From that moment on, stars would be both admired and scrutinized, their private lives as much a spectacle as their performances. We may ask, is this fair? Is it just that those who bring joy on the screen should live under such relentless judgment? And is it just that a woman's tragic death should become the foundation of such a system? Perhaps fairness is not the measure here. What the Arbuckle scandal revealed is not fairness, but the hunger of society, for certainty, for morality, for stories that explain the unease of their times. Virginia's death, Arbuckle's ruin, the studio's fear, these were woven into a narrative that gave meaning, even if false meaning, to a restless age. Let us imagine Hollywood in those years after the scandal. The streets buzzing with automobiles, the studios humming with production, the air thick with the scent of celluloid. Stars walk under the gaze of the public, smiling for photographs, careful with every word. Behind them, contracts lie in drawers, heavy with clauses, reminders that their lives no longer belong entirely to themselves. The scandal of Arbuckle and Rappe is still spoken of, whispered on sets, invoked in meetings, held up as warning. The machine moves on, but the memory lingers like smoke. And beyond Hollywood, Virginia lies in her grave, the flowers upon her stone trembling in the wind. She is silent, yet her silence shapes the industry that ignored her in life. Her death is invoked to enforce order, to protect reputations, to bind actors to rules they did not write. She has become part of history, not in the way she dreamed, but in the way history so often claims the powerless, as example, as symbol, as warning. As this part of the story closes, let us see the flicker of a projector beam cutting through the dark. On the screen, laughter unfolds, comedies play, audiences roar. Yet beneath the laughter lies unease, for everyone knows how quickly joy can turn to scandal, how swiftly a star can fall. The projector hums, the reel turns, the light flickers, the image unresolved, a screen glowing in the darkness, the laughter of the audience rising, while behind the glow lies the shadow of Virginia, still watching, still shaping, even in her silence. The projector hums. The reel turns, the audience laughs, and yet behind the flickering glow, a shadow lingers, faint but insistent, and it carries us into the final part of this long, sorrowful telling. For the story of Virginia Rappe cannot end with laughter in a theater, nor with the clauses of contracts, nor with the ruin of Arbuckle, though all of these are threads entwined with her name. It must end, as all stories do, in reflection. Reflection upon what remains when the voices of witnesses fade, when the presses fall silent, when the graves are overgrown and the lights of Hollywood have long since changed their glow. She was born in hardship, her mother gone before she reached her 4th year, her father absent, her childhood marked by poverty and uncertainty. She was a girl who learned early the fragility of life, who sought in beauty and in art some refuge from the chaos of want. She became a model, an actress, a presence in photographs and in the moving pictures of her time, though never in the grand roles she must have longed for. Still, she pressed forward, carrying her dreams with her into the restless heart of Hollywood. Her path was neither smooth nor celebrated. It was filled with small victories, greater disappointments, and always the fragile hope that tomorrow might bring more. And then came that September of 1921, a holiday weekend at the St. Francis Hotel, a party that began in laughter and ended in silence. What happened behind the closed door of Suite 1219 will never be known with certainty. There are testimonies, accusations, contradictions, but no truth that satisfies all. Out of that uncertainty grew one of the most infamous scandals of its age, and in the storm that followed, Virginia's humanity was swept away. She became a symbol, a headline, a lesson in morality for a society uneasy with its own changes. Her death was real, her suffering undeniable, but what it meant was shaped not by her own voice, but by the voices of others. To some, she was innocent, a victim of cruelty. To others, she was reckless, a woman undone by indulgence. In both versions, she was denied her complexity. She was a daughter, an orphan, a lover, a friend. She laughed, she dreamed, she lived. These truths were buried beneath the scandal, hidden by the thunder of headlines. And Arbuckle, the man bound forever to her in memory, bore the weight of accusation though he was acquitted. He became a symbol of Hollywood's excess, his laughter silenced, his career destroyed. Together they were transformed into a morality tale, their lives consumed by a society hungry for certainty. He lived in disgrace, she was buried in neglect, and in both fates we see the cruelty of scandal. It strips people of themselves and turns them into stories that others tell. What, then, are we to do with this story, told again after more than a century? Perhaps the answer is not to seek certainty, for certainty has eluded every witness, every juror, every historian. Perhaps the answer is to accept ambiguity, to dwell in the silence where truth hides, and in that silence to remember them not as symbols, but as people. To imagine Virginia laughing among friends, Arbuckle tumbling joyfully across a screen, and to honor those images as much as the darker ones. Her grave was neglected, then rediscovered. Flowers were placed upon it, her name spoken once more with tenderness. This, too, is part of her story, the slow restoration of dignity, the recognition that even those who were forgotten can be remembered anew. When we say her name, when we recall her life, we resist the simplification of scandal. We declare that she was more than the cause of another's ruin, more than a cautionary tale. She was Virginia Rappe, born in Chicago in 1891, dead in San Francisco in 1921, remembered now across the span of time. Let us reflect also on how her story shaped the world she never lived to see. Hollywood grew more cautious, contracts more restrictive, gossip more powerful. Stars were bound by morality clauses, their lives scrutinized as closely as their films. The relationship between audience and performer changed forever, and at the center of that change was Virginia, silent, absent, yet shaping the industry in her stillness. Such is the strange power of tragedy. It alters the course of history even as it erases the person who lived it. And so we return to her silence, to her shadow. It lingers in the corridors of the St. Francis Hotel, in the transcripts of trials, in the weathered stone of her grave. It lingers in the laughter that dies too quickly, in the stories that cannot be resolved, in the flowers that wither upon the earth. Her name is spoken still, not always kindly, not always truly, but spoken nonetheless. And perhaps in that speaking, however imperfect, there is a form of remembrance. As we close this telling, let us not seek final answers, for there are none. Let us instead rest in the quiet, where her story drifts like smoke into the night. Perhaps you hear her laughter faintly, perhaps you see her face in the glow of a photograph, perhaps you feel only the ache of injustice. All of these are forms of remembrance, and in remembering her with complexity, with compassion, we restore what scandal took away. The image fades now, a grave with roses trembling in the wind, a projector beam flickering in the dark, a hotel corridor echoing with footsteps that have long since ceased, and in the silence beyond these images, a single name, whispered softly, Virginia.